Well, it is time for our premier sponsor Keynote address, brought to us this morning by ANZ. Our speaker grew up on a farm about an hour down the road in Methven before they had the fancy hot pools. She worked her way up to become one of Aotearoa's most respected macro minds. Given the questions she gets asked, she is one of those people for whom dinner parties and ferry commutes must have been nigh on intolerable for the last 3 years. Please welcome the Chief Economist for ANZ New Zealand, Sharon Zollner.
Thanks very much. Yeah, no, there's lots to talk about. I'm not going to delve too much into the specialised infrastructure space, given there's a lot of people in this room who know a lot more about that than me. However, I will, thank you, set the general context and talk about things like interest rates, which are obviously highly relevant to this sector like everyone else. Oh, there's my slides. Right, great. So I think first things first, a problem shared is not a problem halved. New Zealand has undergone a very similar experience to a lot of countries, and essentially that's because we all had the same shock of COVID, all responded in much the same way, and with the benefit of hindsight, all made much the same mistake, which was not appreciating just how incredibly effective fiscal policy would be, and that people, once they realised that their jobs were secure and money was going to keep coming in the door, and they were shut within those doors and they were very bored, that they would go shopping in a big, big way. So, yeah, jet skis, boats, spas, new kitchens, investment properties. Yeah, money was very cheap, and demand for goods in particular exploded because we couldn't go on holiday. So the world's ability to supply those goods was very constrained at the same time because of the COVID illness and the shipping disruptions and whatnot. So very similar experiences, different flavours. You can see we haven't had it as bad as some. We've been less exposed to the European energy shock, for example. But we've also got a less of a convincing turn in our data so far. Now, some of that's just because we only get CPI data every 3 months rather than every month. But at least it has turned downward. We'll take that. Though obviously at 6.8%, it's still very high. Everyone's really, most of us learn to forecast at the Reserve Bank. Our forecasts are very similar, and that is because our forecasts ask the question, what do interest rates need to be so that inflation does that, so that inflation returns to target over the medium term. And the story, it holds together. You know, the economy is definitely feeling the effects of what's been an incredibly rapid increase in interest rates over a short period, particularly interest rate sensitive sectors such as construction. But there are obviously risks that could affect inflation on both sides. However, we see the risks on balance as tilted to the upside, and do believe that the Reserve Bank will have to raise rates again before the end of the year, while acknowledging that there is a lot of uncertainty. But the issue is the inflation's become broader. It's really got some bulk behind it now. So initially you could point at oil, and you could point at shipping costs, and you could point, a few things and say, well, when those things normalise, we'll be back to normal. But then over time, inflation in New Zealand was stuck around that 7.2, 7.3 for a year, but over that period, big price increases became more common. Inflation gravitated from goods into services, from tradable into non-tradable, from the price of petrol to the price of a haircut, essentially. It's gotten into wages, into inflation expectations, into rents, those sorts of domestic inflation pressures, reflecting that the economy was actually really overheated for quite a period there. So there's two sources of uncertainty that we are all grappling with at the moment. Firstly, how much has the Reserve Bank already slowed the economy without necessarily knowing it yet, because the lags of monetary policy are long? And secondly, how much damage do we actually need to do to growth and spending and employment in order to get inflation down? And there's big uncertainty about both of those things. And as well as that, we've got demand moving around, we've got supply moving around as well. And all we can observe is the sort of the net effect. So it's not surprising that there is a bit more disagreement than usual, perhaps, about exactly where we are now and exactly where we're going. But if you look at the core inflation measures, some of them are still going up, some of them are going sideways, some of them have dropped a smidgen, but they certainly don't scream job done at this point. But of course the Reserve Bank's challenge is that they can't wait until they've clearly done the job before they stop hiking, or they will oversteer. given that it can take a year or even 2 years for interest rates to have their full effect. But it is worth remembering the end of the last business cycle. You know, they hiked, paused for a year, hiked 4 more times, paused for 6 months, hiked twice more. So this is, I would say, their first cut at what they think is necessary. It's pretty good guess, but it is just realistically an educated guess because there's so much uncertainty. A pause is not necessarily a peak. So some good news on the goods inflation side. Shipping costs have normalised. That's not the change in the shipping costs, that's the level. So they've had a wild ride there, but they are back to pretty much where they were. Global supply chain pressures have eased enormously, and firms in our own business survey are reporting that freight disruptions have eased a lot too. Now, this is genuine good news, but some of it is for reasons that aren't all in our favour, in particular weaker global demand and weaker trade. Chinese manufacturers, for example, are suffering from the bullwhip effect in inventories. Certainly speaking to firms around New Zealand, whether they're manufacturing, construction or retail, they're all still working through excess inventories left over from the COVID period. But less global shipping means shipping costs are coming back. And for a little country at the end of the world, that's a clear win. And it will absolutely help to bring headline inflation down in the near term. And firms are telling us that they're going to raise their prices by less. On average, firms are saying they'll be raising their prices by, a bit under 4%. Unfortunately, that is over the next 3 months is the question, not over the next year. So that annualises to about 12%. We only have a year or so of data for this question, but at least it's going in the right direction. And similarly, cost expectations are coming down. Inflation expectations have turned, pricing intentions have turned. And not so much evidence that reported wage growth is falling, but certainly expected wage growth is coming off. So there is some low-hanging fruit, I would say. I mean, just look where the world oil price is for starters. So we are expecting a decent amount of goods disinflation. The question more in our minds is around that services inflation, that core inflation pulse. For now, in March, firms reported their biggest problems were finding labour, regulation paperwork, high rates of pay, and all their other costs. So if you think about it, those 4 either reflect inflation or outright cause inflation. The sorts of problems that bring inflation down are the next tier: low turnover, competition. So both of those things make it harder to push your costs through into your prices, so you get margin squeeze. Interest rates and even cash flow and debtors, the signs of a slowing economy, more price-sensitive consumers, potentially lower employment. Those are the sorts of things that bring inflation down. So again, you wouldn't look at that and say, yep, job done. They're getting there. Here's a slightly more specific question. What is it that is preventing your firm from expanding its production? And you can see we've been in this period where an unbelievably high proportion of firms say it's labour, a shortage of labour. So the Reserve Bank noted in the last monetary policy statement that has now been passed by demand. So more firms are reporting demand as the constraint than labour, which sounds like great, tick that box. But you can see the levels are still very, very unusual, still higher than they reached in the entire last business cycle. So, normally as economic forecasters, we forecast demand and largely assume the wonders of capitalism will sort out the supply side, but that has absolutely not been the case in the last few years. And the most extreme supply disruption for New Zealand has been that closed border and the loss of imported labour, which we have become quite reliant on in a number of sectors, including construction and agriculture. So you can see there was nothing so similar as the early 1970s, and you really don't want to resemble the early 1970s in any way, shape or form. There was obviously a lot of weird stuff going on there, including oil shocks, but you can see what a boom-bust time that was. And now, of course, you can see we've turned, so things could change quite rapidly, particularly now we are importing a lot of workers very, very quickly. But as at the end of March, labour was still quite a constraint. So the Reserve Bank is forecasting unemployment to rise very rapidly from here, and certainly importing all that labour does point in that direction. But if you look at it, it's pretty much a lift and shift initially, at least, of what happened when the global financial crisis hit. And it's true that job ads are down and employment intentions have come off a little bit as well, though they jumped a little bit in the last month. But largely sort of back to trend in terms of job ads at least. And certainly I don't think, it doesn't feel like the global financial crisis out there. I wouldn't say everyone's got the memo yet. In particular, consumers. If you consumer well-being surveys, financial resilience surveys, a continual bright spot is that consumers say their job security is awesome. They're completely confident their job is safe. And yet the Reserve Bank is forecasting unemployment to rise quite rapidly over 5%. So the upshot is somebody's wrong. And it's not really a fair fight because the Reserve Bank's armed with the official cash rate. So if the Reserve Bank thinks it needs to see unemployment rate rise like that, then they have the means to bring it about. But here and now, it doesn't, that fear factor seems to be missing. So I think that again, you've asked the question, can the Reserve Bank be confident it has done enough to persuade people to cool their jets? Yet. So wage growth is still very strong, and I think that is part of the explanation why spending has been holding up pretty well. I mean, private sector average hourly wages are growing at 8%, which is higher than inflation. New Zealand's had positive real wage growth, unlike many other countries. In the UK, you saw their inflation went over 10%. Wages did nothing of the sort, which is why the entire country's been on strike, basically. Now, we haven't had that situation in New Zealand. People have been compensated for inflation, including the minimum wage, and benefits have been indexed over 7%. So why are people so miserable then? You can see here on the left that you ask people, is it a good time to buy a major household item? They'll go, no, it's absolutely not. Have you seen what's happened to the price of everything? And yet, that's normally a really good indicator for spending, but when you look at the actual retail spending, it's all over the blooming shop because of COVID, and this is another problem we have trying to forecast anything, but you can see it hasn't dropped away anything like as much as those traditional survey measures of spend would do. And also in the first 3 months of this year, retail spending came in much weaker than expected, but if you look at the regional breakdown, it was Northland, it was Bay of Plenty, it was Gisborne, it was Hawke's Bay, and then randomly Southland. But mostly it was areas that were quite impacted by the cyclone. So we've got that noise going on as well. Headwinds for spending, obviously mortgage rates are a lot higher, people are rolling over onto those, and that's quite painful. The cost of living means your money doesn't go as far as you would like it to. Job security is deteriorating, though, as I said, there's a mismatch there, and confidence is low. But the tailwinds, the unemployment rate is still extremely low, the wage growth is very high, there's fiscal support more than anticipated, and of course, population growth. So now, Shop doesn't care if it's the old New Zealander coming back or a new New Zealander who's just arrived. They just see strong turnover and the ability to pass costs through without too much difficulty and maybe the need to take on another staff member. The housing market is a bit on the fence really at the moment because we think it's around a turning point. So is it a headwind, is it a tailwind? House values are a lot lower than they were, but we think they're about to start modestly lifting. So ambiguous, I'd say. So upside risk number 2, I would say, is the net migration and its possible impact on the housing market. So the net migration there in the dark blue, I mean, departures are lifting as well. A lot of 20-somethings going off on an OE and a lot of 20-somethings going off to Australia and may or may not come back. But we've also been bringing in huge numbers of people. Now, these numbers are uncertain, they get revised, but it clearly has lifted a huge amount. We saw employment rise 0.8% in the first 3 months of this year, and that could never have happened if we hadn't had a 0.5% lift in the population of working age. So obviously policy's been significantly loosened and net migration's running at a pace well over 100,000. So in the monetary policy statement, the Reserve Bank raised their estimate of migration for this year from 25,000 to 75,000, so tripled it. Now, of course, the impact on inflation is ambiguous. It boosts labour supply, which will take some heat out of wages, but it also boosts demand for housing, so rents and house price growth. Now, we've got an example over the ditch because Australia loosened their migration policy a bit ahead of New Zealand. They're now experiencing very, very strong rental inflation, and their housing market has turned upward more quickly than was anticipated. So back in April, the Reserve Bank talked about net migration as an upside risk to medium-term activity and inflation, but in the monetary policy statement, they were on the fence about which effect would dominate. So they said basically, well, we'll watch rents, we'll watch house prices, we'll watch wages, and we'll wait and see, which obviously certainty is good, but it does come at a price because they won't know that data for for a few months. So you can take a punt at what all these extra people mean for housing demand, looking at the average number of people per house basically, and also look at what's happening to housing supply with consents, and see what's happening to our net housing supply. So we made incredible progress, particularly in Auckland, over recent years in addressing housing shortages, because we had the biggest house building boom ever at a time the population was shrinking, which is pretty weird. It tells you how weird that period was, but it did mean that the fundamental demand-supply balance, particularly in Auckland, changed pretty substantially, and no doubt contributed to that 20% fall in Auckland house prices. But now, of course, both things are going the other way, and we are expecting house shortages to be exacerbated over the period ahead. Builders are pretty pessimistic in our survey. In fact, that might even be understating it, saying things are worse than the global financial crisis. And I mean, you can see why. The house prices have fallen. The construction costs have really only just started to fall. The bank credit is harder to get. And the gap between a price of an existing property and the price of building a new property, the math just doesn't work. So, but now we've got this really strong migration, and we're expecting house prices to start turning around. Potentially, the mood could improve. But right here, right now, builders are the most pessimistic sector across the economy, really, along with farmers, who are also doing it pretty tough with the highest expected costs across the economy. So construction costs have been a little bit slow to fall, actually. Normally there's a pretty decent relationship with what's happening to house prices, but anecdotally the price of timber building materials in particular is now dropping away quite quickly. Things like cedar and gyp building quotes are coming in lower. The big firms are starting to compete for the rats and mice jobs to keep their guys busy, that sort of thing. So that's got a 8.7% weight in the CPI directly. So it does matter quite a lot that is coming down. So the housing cycle, yeah, it was basically a 7-year cycle compressed into 2. Obviously, mortgage rates fell very sharply there initially, but I think one of the most stimulatory things the Reserve Bank did was actually suspending the LVR restrictions for a year. It didn't even get a mention in the monetary policy review of the COVID era because it's not supposedly monetary policy, but effectively, they told property investors, you've got 12 months to take on all the leverage you've ever wanted to do before we slam the door shut in your face again. And it just caused an absolute bun fight between investors and first home buyers. That you can see how house prices increased twice as much in a year as our normal indicator would have suggested. And then, of course, we had a very rapid turn. The CCCFA consumer legislation threw a lot of sand in the mortgage machine, and the tax change for property investors that you couldn't deduct the interest on investment property suddenly changed the maths very dramatically. So very sharp turn. We've had house prices fall 16% with very little blood on the floor, you'd have to say. No one suggested to me that that's a bad thing, that house prices have fallen 16%. That is, believe it or not, a soft landing, but we do think that's about it. For now, at least. That would take real house prices back to where they were pre-COVID, which is about 25% lower than they were at the peak. That's what matters for housing affordability. It would leave nominal house prices well above where they were, and that's what matters for negative equity. So I would say we've inched our way out of this corner we painted ourselves into, but we haven't obviously solved our housing affordability problem. To get back to where we were in 2010, for example, real house prices would have to halve, just about. To get back to where we were in the early 1990s, real house prices would have to fall about 70%. So our house prices are still very, very high, and absolutely there is still downside risk. There's a lot of fresh air under them if we were to have a really nasty recession and a very sharp rise in unemployment. But right here, right now, we think the risk is rather the other way. Given the migration, given the suspension of the LVR restrictions, the Reserve Bank, the tweaking, the Reserve Bank has said that 15% rather than 10% of new owner-occupied lending can be at a high, that's 80% loan-to-value ratio. So that doesn't sound like much, 10 to 15, but it's a 50% increase in the share of something that's been shrinking and we now think will be growing. So it could have quite an accelerator effect. Certainly the feedback from brokers is that there is unmet demand for high LVR lending, even at these much, much higher interest rates. There's plenty of true believers out there who think that this is a window of opportunity to buy before house prices take off again. Not our view, but not an uncommon view, I suspect. The right-hand chart, because we're at a turning point, you will see conflicting headlines about what's happening to house prices, because there's like at least 3 well-followed measures of house prices, and then you can do various things to the indices. So you'll just get that messiness around a turning point. But this is the REI and Z house price data, and for us, the CoreLogic data for the Reserve Bank, but you can see very similar over history, versus the Barfoot and Thompson auction clearance rate. Now, we like that one because it's got the longest lead to house prices of any indicator out there. So people are focusing on the fact that sales are still really low, but the thing is listings are still really low as well. So there is quite intense competition for those houses that are on the market, and you can see it has definitely turned, like basically at the end of last year. And it's already suggesting upside risk to the Reserve Bank's updated forecast that house prices are going to keep falling for the rest of this year. So the good news on household debt, it's not as high as you might think, because you have to really deflate it by incomes to get a sensible measure, and wage growth's been really strong and employment's been really strong. The employment rate, the proportion of people in paid employment, is at record highs. So it means that households can handle more debt. The debt servicing ratio, the proportion of income that's being spent on servicing debt, troughed at 5%, it'll go to 10 or 11, so it's doubling, but still only 2/3 of where it peaked in the last cycle. So it's not the case that the Reserve Bank's putting an unprecedented burden on households, or put another way, it's not the case that the level of household debt is a firm lid on the OCR at today's levels. Now, of course, there are people who are stressed. I'm absolutely not denying that. But financial stability policy worries about those people. Monetary policy worries about the median or average household who so far is coping fine. Fiscal policy is an upside risk to inflation pressures and therefore to interest rates as well. This is the net debt statistics, for example. Compared to the half-year update at the end of last year, there's plans to spend an extra $5 billion this year, which is 1.4% of GDP. You know, that's pretty large. Around 2/3 of that is capital expenditure, which typically governments struggle to spend capex as fast as they intend, as this room will be well aware of that. The question is, how inflationary will it be to even try? OPEX, on the other hand, governments are pretty good at shoveling that out the door. So that's worth about 0.5% of GDP. So it comes down to really how much spare capacity you think is in the economy to absorb this extra demand, and we have a different view on that to the Reserve Bank, which is, as I said, not surprising or unexpected, given that both the supply and demand side of the economy are moving. And there's the capital cash flows. So you can see that over 2024 and 2025 in particular, there is definitely more there to be spent. And then there's also unallocated capital spend over the next 10 years as well. So pretty ambitious numbers there. All right, there we go. And just finally, I'd just like to point out that we're not going to have a recession because Adrian Orr thinks we need one. You know, we'll put it another way, the counterfactual is not to carry on the way we have been. We've been spending way beyond our means in recent years, and that's showing up in the fiscal deficit, but also in our trade balance, which is in a deep, dark hole at the moment, because we have been on a bit of a bender, really, in terms of our consumption. So at 8.9% of GDP, you know, that's a pretty big credit card bill with the rest of the world there, and if we don't sort things out, we'll have to start selling the family silver. Or our funders offshore may decide that we're actually a bit riskier than they thought and start charging us more to borrow. We could get a ratings downgrade, which would see the exchange rate potentially fall quite quickly. You can see how great recessions are for current account deficits in 2009 there. Massive improvement, but not really the adjustment path we would choose to be on. So, yeah, the current account is screaming, cool your jets as well. If something is unsustainable, it will end, and we cannot keep spending as if we are a lot richer than we really are. I mean, monetary and fiscal policy can't magic up resources or wealth. They can only move spending through time, fill a hole in demand by persuading us to borrow more ourselves, if this is in monetary policy, or by borrowing more directly, in the case of fiscal policy. Both were enormously successful, but at some point you've got to pay the piper, and the current account is telling us that that day is approaching, I would say. Thank you. I'll leave it there. If you run a business, we'd love to have you in our survey. Just email nzeconomics@anz.com. And if you're not sure you get our research, then it's research.anz.com. And then I think I've got pages of disclaimers, which I'll leave you to read in your own time. How about, yeah, 3 pages of them. So there you go. Jack, perhaps I'll leave you to read that one. Thank you.
I know we've only got a couple of minutes. Thank you very much. That's just so good, so comprehensive. Oil prices. Last couple of days, Saudi Arabia has said that it's cutting production. We are, as it currently stands, and I know the government said this a few times, Grant Robertson said it feels like half a dozen times over the last 8 or 10 months. We are currently expecting the excise tax cut to be ended very shortly. What will be that impact in the short term?
Yeah, so the excise cut, well, that'll add about 0.5% back onto CPI inflation. But the good news is happening at a time when the oil price is an awful lot lower. Of course, people don't like petrol prices going up, and indeed research you can show that it can have an outsized impact on consumer inflation expectations. So yeah, we'll wait and see how that one goes. Globally, oil prices have been under real pressure because the Chinese economy is under real pressure, and they are the big marginal demand story. But of course, in the background, you've got geopolitics and some changing dynamics there, and for example, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the US, for example, that's been quite a contributor to stability in the oil prices now looking a little shakier, that sort of thing. So I would say the oil price remains a risk on both sides.
What about Ukraine?
Yes, the direct impact on New Zealand hasn't been large so far in terms of inflation pressure, but it obviously has fed into the deteriorating relationship between the US and China. And New Zealand has rather a large stake in that relationship as we and Australia dance on the tightrope between the two, with the one being the largest strategic partner and the other being the biggest trading partner. And the share of our exports that goes to China has been steadily increasing on average over time, with the forestry sector probably the most exposed.
At what point do we start to feel the unemployment shock?
That is a very interesting question and a very important one. My gut feel is that it's still a few months away. I mean, we've had a few incidences of job losses in some bigger companies, but mostly due to bespoke things. The construction sector, we've had some failures, but there's still demand for those skills in other areas. So far, the indicators of labour market tightness suggest that when people do lose a job, they've got a pretty good shot of finding something else. It's when that starts to change that people decide actually they might have a significant interruption to their income, that they'll start to feel they need to save more, that freak out factor will kick in. And I just don't think that has yet.
Yeah. Hey, thank you so much. We always appreciate your insights. Join me in thanking ANZ Chief Economist Sharon Zollner.
Thank you.
Thank you.